Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to begin its study of parliamentary protocol related to the incident in the Speaker's Gallery on Friday, September 22nd. Care for the interpreters must be taken. The House administration is here, so I'm sure you know very well. The earpiece is a resource, it's a tool, it's not a gadget, so if you can keep it away from the microphone, it would be great for the ears of the interpreters. We received an email that was circulated around last night in regards to someone who has some experience on this file who would like to appear. I would ask members if we are good with inviting this individual. We can also discuss this at the end of the meeting. Are we okay with having this individual appear? Any concerns? We'll find a suitable spot for them and we can proceed accordingly. I'll leave it to the clerk and myself to determine then. Thank you. And we will maintain a consolidated speaking list because today we have with us Eric Jantz, the clerk of the House of Commons, Michelle Bedard, law clerk and parliamentary counsel, Office of the Law Clerk and Parliamentary Counsel, Patrick McDonnell, Sergeant at Arms and Corporate Security Officer. I thank you always for your service and your team service. Jeffrey LeBlanc, Deputy Clerk Procedure, Stéphane Aubé, Acting Deputy Clerk Administration, Jeremy LeBlanc, Clerk Assistant and Director General, International and Interparliamentary Affairs, Nancy Antil, the C was silent, sorry, Nancy Antil, Chief of Protocol and Events Management. I understand there's one person providing opening comments, so you will have up to 10 minutes for those comments, and then we will start with questions and comments from committee members. The floor is yours. Welcome to Procedure and House Affairs.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I realize there's a small army of us here appearing before you today. We figured that this was the best way to ensure that we can answer all of the committee's questions. So thank you for inviting me and my colleagues to appear today in relation to the address to Parliament by His Excellency Volodymyr Zelensky, which took place on September 22nd, 2023. Given what transpired during the event, I certainly recognize the desire of all members to ensure that such an incident never occurs again. I'm here to give the committee a description of the House Administration's role in extending invitations to guests during addresses to Parliament and screening them for physical threats. From time to time, the House of Commons chamber is the site for a joint address to Parliament by a distinguished visitor, usually a head of state or a head of government. À titre d'hôte, le président joue un rôle de premier plan lors de ces cérémonies dont le déroulement suit un protocole bien établi.
We'll just have to pause because there is no translation.
Parce qu'il n'y a pas d'interprétation. Est-ce que vos mots d'allocution ont été partagés avec les interprètes? Oui, on a le signe, donc on revient.
As the host, the Speaker takes a preeminent role in such events, which are organized in accordance with an established process. Throughout the planning and execution of any address, the Parliamentary Protocol Office ensures that information is shared among all partners, coordinates logistical and protocol requirements, and ensures that all arrangements follow established parliamentary practice.
Of invitations to guests present in the chamber and in the galleries during an address. While members of the House of Commons occupy their desks, additional seats in the centre aisle of the chamber are designated for senators and certain Canadian and foreign dignitaries. A number of seats that are not occupied by parliamentarians are distributed based on a pre-established guest list, which includes certain groups on the table of precedence for Canada, as well as the Prime Minister's office, the visiting delegation, and the speakers. The remaining seats are allotted to senators and members of the House of Commons. The formula used for the distribution is developed by the House Administration and approved by the Prime Minister's office and the parties for each address. In recent years, the breakdown of available seats per party and group has reflected the current standings for each in the Senate and the House of Commons. Une fois la répartition des sièges approuvée, tous les groupes.
Once the allocation of seats have been approved, each group is invited to submit their lists of intended guests to the Parliamentary Protocol Office, which sends invitations. Each group and party that submits names is responsible for their own guest list. These lists are not shared with other parties or groups. In keeping with the independence of Parliament, they are not shared with the government either.
has been the subject of much discussion. Guest lists provided to the Protocol Office are not shared with other parties or groups, and in keeping with the principle of independence of Parliament, they are not shared with the government either. Comme c'est le cas pour la plupart des événements se déroulant sur le
As for the most events taking place on Parliament Hill, when Parliamentary Protocol Office receives guest lists, they ensure that the names of the guests are shared with parliamentary security partners, which includes the Parliamentary Precinct Access. These teams, among others, will verify the names of guests against a security database and assist with accreditation.
must go through a physical security screening process when they arrive on Parliament Hill. Guests to parliaments are not screened for reputational threats, which, in any event, would be difficult to achieve in the very short time available for the organization of such ceremonies. In addition, it is worth pointing out that almost all guests are merely spectators and play no formal role in an address to Parliament. For the address to Parliament that took place on September 22nd, Mr. Hunka and his son's names were submitted to the Speaker of the House of Commons, were submitted by the Speaker of the House of Commons and his office to the Parliamentary Protocol Office. The process was the same as for previous addresses and for other groups that could submit the names of guests. Il existe des lignes directrices et une marche à suivre.
There are guidelines and processes that exist on the matter of recognition of guests surrounding these recognitions that occur during sittings of the House of Commons. These guidelines are designed to permit the orderly and appropriate recognition of dignitaries in the Speaker's gallery without unduly interfering with the flow of business on the House of the floor. With present recognition guidelines apply when the House is in session, they do not extend to special ceremonies or events taking place at the House of Commons that are not official sittings of the House. Such an address to Parliament is a distinguished visitor. It's worth noting that the practice of recognizing these in the gallery during the address is a relatively new practice. During recent addresses, the PM or distinguished visitor has sometimes taken to do this during their remarks. Of course, during the event in September, the Speaker also chose to do this. The House of Commons administration was not sought and his remarks were not communicated.
At these high-profile events, should this practice continue. Indeed, Speaker Fergus has offered in October some suggestions to the House leaders for their feedback about additional steps that might be taken in relation to guests of the Speakers or the Prime Minister. In conclusion, I would like to emphasize the House administration's desire to play a role in ensuring that a similar situation as the one that took place in the most recent address to Parliament does not happen again. With that, I would like to thank you again for having invited me to appear before the committee. My colleagues and I will be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you for those opening comments. We will now enter into 6-minute rounds, starting with Mr. Calkins, suivi par Madame Fortier, et puis Madame Goudreau, and then ending with Miss Matheson. Mr. Calkins. Okay, and I'll just say, I've in the past provided some leniency, and we have a lot of new members at this at PROC now. Would you like me to continue chairing as I always done, or would you like me to chair when the time ends to end the time? I, as chair, do have prerogative so that if witnesses do not have any time to comment, I am able to provide them time to comment, which I will continue doing. So that's not a question. But should I continue chairing as I have chaired, looking for agreement? I see some agreement. Excellent. So I will continue doing that. Mr. Calkins, 6 minutes through the chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my question is about the event. And can you confirm, Mr. Jantz, that the visit of President Zelensky to Canada, including his address to the House of Commons, was at the invitation of the government, and it was the initiative of the Prime Minister?
Addresses to Parliament are indeed initiated by the government, but there's a motion that's actually adopted by, or actually in both houses.
Can you tell us who tabled the motion?
We'd have to look that up. Was
it a minister, or was it somebody, a parliamentary secretary, or was it just somebody from the House of Commons?
We can maybe You can dig that up while we maybe go to your next questions.
Can you confirm that the address by President Zelensky was actually not an official sitting day of the House of Commons?
Indeed, it's the event is held in the House of Commons chamber, but it's not considered a sitting of the House.
And that the context of that was because the House adopted a motion to not have a sitting day in order for the government to host President Zelensky using the House of Commons as the venue. Would that be a fair summation of what happened?
I think so, and I've just received information. The motion for the address was moved by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader and was adopted by unanimous consent.
Okay, so as we know, the Prime Minister also had another event. I know that doesn't apply to you, but had the government decided to host President Zelensky over at the Chateau Laurier in the Grand Ballroom, none of you would have been involved in that. Is that true?
Correct.
So the only reason that House administration and the Speaker's office is involved is because the government made a choice to host the President, which has happened many times with all previous governments. They made the decision to use the People's House, the House of Commons, to host the event. So just so we're absolutely clear.
It's a pretty standard parliamentary
Yeah,
event.
it's very standard, very, yeah. So now it comes to the question of, given the fact that this has been a standard thing, and it's happened in the 18 years that I've been a member of Parliament, I've been here with 2 different prime ministers. Each prime minister has invited dignitaries, presidents, or heads, like you said, heads of state or heads of government to address a joint sitting of Parliament, even though it's not an official sitting day. The mace was not on the table, correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now the question then becomes a process of, as you've described it, the House of Commons finds itself in this awkward situation now of being the host of the event at the request of the government without the capacity or tools to properly vet. But the speaker, the former speaker, Anthony Rota, actually said in his interview with CTV North Bay that normally lists go to the Prime Minister's office and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and then the invitation goes out from protocol, which seems to contradict the testimony that you gave. So who's telling? Who's more accurately describing what actually happens, Mr. Jans?
No, it's a fair question, Mr. Calkins. I understand the committee was hoping to meet with Mr. Rota, so that's certainly a question for him. Certainly from the House Administration side, the Office of Protocol does not share those lists. I don't know if either Mr. Rota or his office shared them, but we certainly didn't.
Okay, and as you say, the Sergeant at Arms is here, and we have the physical security is done. Everybody that comes in goes through that physical security and screening process. You mentioned specifically in your remarks that no one is screened for any potential reputational damage, but that seems to be, to me, an issue that only the government would have the capacity to do. Would anybody in the House of Commons have, or would anybody in service to the House or an officer of the House have the ability to even find out that information?
I'll maybe start, and Pat, you can jump in after. I think we would, provided we had sufficient time. I think that's the challenge, especially with this particular event. It was organized in a very, very tight deadline under some very difficult security arrangements. 99.9% of attendees at such events are exactly that. They're attendees, they're not participants, they're not being recognized. So it then perhaps begs the question, do you have to do background checks on everybody who's just a spectator versus somebody who might play a different role? I don't know, Pat, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I'll just confirm that we have the ability, given the time, to do an open source check on an individual.
So the differentiation of guests as well. You mentioned there are people who attend and there are people who are selected and highlighted and publicly show up in the public address. There was no difference in the treatment of those individuals according to the current protocol?
That's correct. Yeah. Because in this case, we were not aware that the speaker was going to recognize somebody in the gallery.
Do you have any questions there? Sure. I'll share my time with Mr. Duncan.
Just 20 seconds?
20 seconds.
I'll wait for the number.
I'll just take my time then. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The clock stopped 5 minutes, 44 seconds out of 6 minutes. Madame Fortier, 6 minutes through the chair.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chair. As a new member, I'm quite pleased to participate in this study. I've already tried to do my homework and get ready for this. So my first question would be, why are we here today? And I think Madame Gaudreau asked the same question last week. I've had discussions with certain parliamentarians, senators, and members to know what's going on in the House or both chambers. And our role as a committee is to discuss issues, arrive at some conclusions and perhaps recommendations. So if a similar incident occurs, we won't find ourselves in the same result. We'd like to find out what happened on the 22nd of September in the House of Commons. I understand that there are procedures and protocols to recognize people in regular sessions in the galleries. You've mentioned yourself, Mr. Jans, in your opening remarks. What can distinguish a regular sitting of the House of Commons and a joint session of Parliament? In Chapter 7, on line 115, on page 339, French version, there is a protocol, but it's not defined. If we go a little bit further, Chapter 9, because there's a footnote, you go to page 432, we talk about a protocol, but I don't have the protocol in complete. Well, I know the procedural manual, but not to that degree. Protocol for an appearance or an address or to recognize people in the gallery. Well, I didn't see for joint sessions of the Houses, Parliament. It was a joint session. And this is where this situation arose. Do you have a specific protocol or procedure for a joint session as opposed to a simple session? Well, my colleague is more familiar with the protocol than I am, so I'll let her answer. Briefly, for joint sessions of the House, what differs is that senators are invited to sit on the floor of the House, and the first seats are for parliamentarians. Then, common practice, the usual customary uses, over the last few years at least, we have the Chief Justice, former PMs and premiers, and Governor Generals. So these are the distinguished guests, if you will, including members of the delegation from Ukraine. No, that's the distribution of seats on the floor. Whatever is left over is shared in a prorated ratio. If there are 300 seats, we see what the proportional representation of the various political parties and groups, and they are allotted a certain number of seats in consequence. Each group or party in the Senate or in the House will see what their allotment is, and then they can provide us a guest list. Well, then when you receive the guest list, what happens? How can we ensure that these individuals, from a security perspective or legitimately or whatever, who takes the final decision and who will be sent an invitation? Well, those who selected their guests are responsible for their choices. Then this is shared with the security unit so that we can ensure the physical security. Well, if the speaker wants to recognize somebody in the gallery, is there a protocol for that? Well, it's the same procedure for the speaker, whether it's the Speaker of the House or the Senate, for the guest list. But for recognizing somebody in either of the chambers, there's no specific protocol. It's up to the discretion of the Speaker of the House or Senate. Would that be a recommendation that we should have a specific protocol for who gets recognized officially during an address? Well, when it's a regular session of the House, we generally share some of that information, but there's no hard and fast rule. If the same procedure applied to addresses, perhaps it would help, but we can suggest or recommend. We cannot really force anyone to do that. So there would appear as guidelines, perhaps, for any visits or such addresses. Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean. You said parliamentarians take the decision. Well, I think my time's up. I'm sorry.
On n'a pas compris la question, donc vous pouvez continuer.
Okay, we'll continue with the question after, if you wish, to get the answer. Madame Goudreau, 6 minutes for you. Thank you, Chair. Now, if I understood you correctly, there are specific protocols for special ceremonies or events. I'd like to know, how can an ex-Nazi soldier enter Parliament, even if he had been invited by Speaker Rota, but the Prime Minister invited him to Toronto? Can you explain how this person who was here in Parliament, despite all the security measures? Well, it might be Pat that would answer this question. All invitees, all guests, the names are filtered through the security office. Even if someone has a bad past, if you will, the past is the past. If he's a Canadian citizen, he's been a Canadian citizen for 50 years. So perhaps that's why he didn't show up on any watch list or any other such list.
There's a reputational risk, and the only way to avoid a reputational risk here is to do a verification of their background. So ça, c'est la seule façon pour nous.
This is the only way that we can validate his reputation. Well, I understand what you're saying, but I'm trying to understand how a former Nazi soldier, and we have the President, His Excellency Zelensky, who shows up as a guest, and Speaker Rota takes an initiative to invite this individual. But the Prime Minister invited the same character to an event in Toronto. I suppose he must have trusted, depended on the Speaker's opinion.
If you have 500 guests, you'd have to do the background on 500 guests. We didn't know that this gentleman was being recognized by the Speaker. So we do the physical security, we do database check and see if they're a risk to our parliamentarians or to Parliament itself. But the reputational check on 500 people would take weeks if ever we were mandated to do it. So.
On a plein de leçons, hein, et puis on va s'en occuper.
Well, there's lots of lessons to be learned on this, I think, and we will continue to learn, not because it's a special ceremony, that it should be different processing, particularly when it's a question of the House. So my question is for Madame Anskill. I mean, some red flag must go up at some point or another. Now, when do you decide, no, that's good enough, he's not on any list, no problems from a physical security point of view? We did ask for information what preceded this event. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about correspondences that went on. Well, this individual is on the list, and he received his invitation like everyone else once he'd been processed for security, physical security. Okay, that being said, I mean, a speaker, he retired, he withdrew. Was he asked to resign? I mean, what do we do about that? What correspondence went on? Was pressure put on him? I mean, the Prime Minister must have been aware. Well, that part of the PMO is not mine. I'm not involved in any of that. I mean, those are completely isolated from ours. There's a firewall. So I really can't comment on communications that were internal to PMO or PCO. We received names from Mr. Rota, which came through his office, the Speaker's office, and they were treated like all other lists of guests coming from all authorized sources. Well, okay, I don't want to point the finger, but if it takes 48 hours, 500 guests, let's say, I mean, you know, something messed up. Well, we were not aware. We hadn't been told that this person posed any threat or risk. Of the 500 people that were invited, we don't know the reputational or background of any of these individuals particularly. Okay. I'd like to understand what happened afterwards. I'm quite upset about the fact that Speaker Rota was forced to resign or resigned, or we don't know. But I'd like to request that, Madam Chair. You know, we went up to D-Day on this, but we'd like to know what happened after with Mr. Rota. I'm really quite curious as to the whys and how of his resignation.
It's through the chair. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses. It's quite a lineup we have here, and I am very grateful that you've taken time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. You are that central core, I think, of what we know in terms of security and ongoings of the House. I just want to kind of go back to points I think that other members didn't necessarily get to find clarification. Mr. McDonough, when you talked about watch lists that you have, can you define those? Can you explain those and which ones they are?
Yeah, so the Parliamentary Access Group, they received a list, and they'll enter a name, one name at a time, into a database. And it's quite simple. If a red light appears, there's a doubt, and further investigation is required. And if it's green, the access is granted. And there's different ways to find yourself or find oneself on that database.
So what would be examples of that red light?
I don't want to get into too much detail.
Yeah, as much as you can.
I will have created a disturbance here before.
Okay.
That would be one way.
Only here or with other police forces or other levels
A threat to
jurisdiction?
parliamentarians and a threat to Parliament itself, if that has come to
Specifically
our attention.
Parliament. Okay. So they're not like...
Parliamentarians here and in the community.
Okay. And that's a combination of what we experience with local, like at the local level, through the RCMP, that sort of thing as well.
We exchange information with the RCMP
Okay.
and 91 police forces.
Okay. And then that, and I'm just trying to think my way through all that. So, but that doesn't happen or that happens for all the guests from the list that you receive from each party that is sent through protocol, and then you do that for each of them. But that's that physical risk that you're talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. That reputational risk has to be that search, that thorough risk assessment has to be done by the parties themselves. You don't have any part in that.
If I was mandated to do it, I have the resources to do an open source verification.
Well, so then what would
But it
would that be different than the physical search that you're talking about with the red
Yeah,
light?
it'd be a
green light?
reputational, so it'd be an open source intelligence search.
And then, okay, so what would that look like if you're able to talk about it?
Yeah, I have analysts that do that sort of thing and focus mostly on dangers and threats towards members of parliament. And so we don't do it currently. If mandated, it'd be a question of resources and being mandated by the Board of Internal Economy to do so.
But then that individual party would have to ask for it, or would protocol ask for it, or like who would ask for it?
It'd be the board.
I think it would depend how things are set up. To date, reputational verifications have not been part of what we have been asked to do, either the protocol office or the security office, when there's events like an address to Parliament. If that was the desire, then, as Pat alluded to, there would be resource requirements that would have to be addressed, time requirements that would have to be addressed. To date, we've always expected that the parties would do some kind of background checks before submitting the names to us. Again, I've had permission from Speaker Fergus to share a little bit what he shared with the House leaders. One recommendation would be, rather than doing reputational risks on all the guests, all 500, only do reputational verifications on anybody who might be recognized in the gallery by any of the individuals addressing Parliament.
And that's a recommendation that you would suggest for here as well as part of our report.
It could be something the committee might want to consider.
Okay. It was also mentioned, I think, by Ms. Ensel that the event was rushed. So did that play a part in the ability to not do that thorough search? Like, is that typical for these sort of events? I mean, I know a lot of work goes into them, and it's a huge production. So that this one being specifically rushed, is that part of the consideration of that reputational risk assessment and what's being asked?
It was indeed very rushed. The timeline was very, very tight. However, it is not the mandate of the protocol office to do those reputational threats for all the guests that are invited.
Okay. And so you too would recommend that it either stay with the parties or only those recognized be.
That it be
Yeah.
addressed whose responsibility it is.
Yeah. But the fact that the speaker didn't say or give any sort of notice that there would be a recognition inlays the problem of even that further recommendation.
And to that very point, that's again something Speaker Fergus has suggested to the parties, is that if one of the interveners in an address to Parliament, so either the guest, the Prime Minister, the Speaker of the House, Speaker of the Senate, intends on recognizing somebody in the gallery, that name, that information is shared with all the parties and all the groups, so that everybody can undertake their own background checks, if they will, before sharing with their group or their caucus whether or not this person should be applauded or not.
Okay. Madam Chair, time? What time do I have? Oh,
12
well,
seconds. 11 seconds.
Then I'll ask other questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now enter into our second round, and we will do 5 minutes to Mr. Duncan, followed by 5 minutes to Mr. Gerritsen, suivi par 2 minutes et demie à Madame Goudreau, et puis 2 minutes et demie à Madame Matheson, et puis s'il y en a du temps, je vais donner quelques minutes aux conservateurs.
And then I'll give a few minutes to the Conservatives and the Liberals, but if we don't have time, we'll have to close on that point. Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Mr. Macton, I want to pick up on the open source check again and just kind of getting some clarification about what would normally be done. You mentioned about an open source check being done pertaining to physical security or threats to members, not so much further background to that, but you'd said normally that would have been done. In this rush timeframe, what were you not able to do in the vetting of the guests? Were you able to go through each guest for those threats? Were you able to do, or would you normally have done more? What more would you normally have done on the timeframe?
Through you, Madam Chair, I must have misspoke because normally we don't do reputational checks on any guest.
So, but you had all the opportunity. That was, it was a rush time frame. You were able to do your open source check on that for the time frame you were provided.
No, there's no open source checks ever done for a joint address on any of the invitees.
Okay. The question, where I get this, I want to go back to the comments from the former speaker that he made to CTV Northern Ontario about the fine-tooth comb, and just trying to figure out who's done that. Then the former speaker's comment said, quote, normally it goes to the Prime Minister's office and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb, and then the invitation goes out from protocol, unquote. So I'm just trying to figure out that the speaker is saying there's a former speaker saying there's a fine-tooth comb process here, and still struggling to understand. He's saying, in this case, that the Prime Minister's office had the list. So you had alluded to this before, Mr. Jantz, about that, but where I'm a bit curious about this, in the document production that we received over the course of the last couple of months or so, it's a little bit curious that if the Prime Minister's office was not given a complete list of invitees, how is it possible then on September 20th, there was a text message exchange between Parliamentary Protocol Coordinator and the Prime Minister's Outreach Advisor about a certain individual who was invited that was actually on a Conservative guest list? They were inquiring why they had been invited and saying it wasn't on their list. How would they know in that case? I'm a little bit confused about they didn't have the list, why they would know a Conservative guest was invited.
If I can add, quite often there are guests that appear on more than one list. So that's what we do. Often there are guests that would be on the Conservative list as well as on the Liberal list and can be on the NDP list. So when we would advise is when somebody would be on more than one list.
And my point being is, if it wasn't on the Prime Minister's office list, then according to them and what happened here, how would they know about a member that was on it? They were saying it wasn't on their list, but they were aware of somebody else. It seems to me a little bit suspicious. The former speaker says it goes to the Prime Minister's office, a fine-tooth comb. We have a text message exchange that says it wasn't on their list, but they knew the individual had been invited and clearly on somebody else's list. It just makes wonder why the Prime Minister's office was aware of that if the claim was they didn't have the list and didn't do anything.
I would need to look at the text you're referring to know exactly what name they're talking about, but I can assure you the list was not shared with the Prime Minister's office. It was the practice this time. It's been the practice since I've been the Chief Protocol. So for the last 6 years, we have not shared the list with the Prime Minister's office for addresses to
Your
Parliament.
office or your staff that you work in had not shared it.
Yes.
Another question I have is about in the documents we received, there was the following day on September 21st, one day before the event, an email from the Sergeant at Arms office went to Jason Ritchie regarding arranging parking for Mr. Hunka, and states that he is, quote, an honored guest, not just a guest, but an honored guest. What makes a guest an honored guest in this circumstance here?
Yeah, probably is that the speaker requested a parking spot from my staff, and so my staff added the word honored as a descriptor.
In that
Nothing
case,
more than that.
and how many honored guests would there have been numbers-wise?
That's the only one I'm aware of that they asked for parking.
Right. Okay. And I think I go to that point of where you get into that process of being an honored guest and having that list. I go back again of where it just seems to be a disconnect, of where you have the former speaker himself saying a list is provided of guests, honored guests, all of that, and Prime Minister's office being aware of certain individuals that weren't on their list. It just goes to say of where it may not have been in your case a member directly, but there is some way that the Prime Minister's office did have a list outside of their own, and we're questioning why someone received an invite, and even questioning that they shouldn't have received one as well. I find a little questioning, so I will leave it at that because I've got about 2 seconds left on the time.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Mr. Garrettson, 5 minutes through the chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I just want to go back, Mr. Jantz, to the discussion about the open source. Mr. McDonald, about the open source. So you're saying that you don't typically do these open source vetting processes, correct? I've heard you say that a couple of times. You didn't do them this day, but you typically don't do them.
Never.
Never. You never do them. Okay. Mr. Jantz, you talked about the possibility of, in the future, doing a reputational risk. You might make that as a suggestion, but would that be for the Speaker's office? Or correct me if I'm wrong, it looks like you...
Yeah, no, obviously it wouldn't be for all 500 guests. That would be way too time consuming and we would require way too many resources. The suggestion would be anybody who will be recognized by any of the
would have a reputational risk.
Those individuals would be.
Is that checked. Where Mr. McDonald's open source assessment comes in? Yeah. So in an open source assessment, you said you have analysts that could help to do that work. They look into it. Do you think that they would have discovered this had they done that on this particular individual?
Yes.
You do? Okay. The reputational risk that you're saying might be a suggestion, or is a suggestion for future people that are being recognized. You definitely don't do that now, correct, Mr. Jantz? That is something that does not exist.
That's correct.
Okay. So in the exchange with Mr. Calkins in the beginning, when Mr. Calkins was asking about this being in a different, like, if, it's a different room essentially because Parliament is not sitting, he then said, well, I guess you don't have, I guess you didn't have the reason, I wrote it down, you didn't have the proper tool, guys, just, he said, without the proper tools to vet. And then you responded and said, yeah, that's correct. So I don't understand what you meant there because it sounds like you didn't already have the tools, and even if you did, we certainly don't use them.
Right. No, perhaps I misspoke. Tools is one thing, as Sergeant Arms has indicated. We have the tools. I think it would be more an issue of the time as well it would take if you wanted to do that for all 500 guests, which is why the suggestion is maybe limit it just to a few.
Okay.
Those who have more than just a spectator role.
But when an event like this does go on in the room, even though it's not an official sitting, you still have access to the tools that you would normally have access to. Time constraints considered as well, correct? Yeah, okay. Yeah, actually, that's all that I have, Madam Speaker. Or, Madam Speaker.
Chair. I'll take it. Ms. Romanado.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. Thank you so much for being here today. Mr. Jantz, you mentioned something. You mentioned that normally an attendee has no role during a special joint address of Parliament, and that the recognition of someone in the gallery is not normally done. When I look at Chapter 9 of Boston Gagnon, they do have in Figure 9.1 a list of all of the special addresses from 1940 until 2017 of special speakers in the House. Would you know if ever there was somebody recognized in the gallery during one of these addresses? Is this the first time that someone was recognized in the speaker during a joint address by the speaker?
That's a very good question, Ms. Romanado. It's a fairly recent development. I'm trying to think the first time it happened. Was it the Biden address? Maybe Jeffrey, do you want to jump in?
I don't remember it being done before the Biden address, but there were definitely people recognized in the gallery during the Biden address. That was in March of last year.
And this was someone recognized by the speaker officially?
I don't believe it was by the speaker. I believe it was by the Prime Minister. I'm testing my memory, but I believe it was by the Prime Minister.
So there's a difference between the Prime Minister in his address recognizing people in the gallery or in the crowd or so on and so forth, but what we're referring to is the speaker independently recognizing someone in the speaker's gallery in the section reserved, and in this case he had 8 seats allocated to him based on the information provided at the list of precedents. Would you say that going forward, anybody, I don't know about you, but when I was asked if I would like to bring a guest, I make sure that whoever I put forward on a list to attend a special address or a joint address at Parliament is somebody that would be worthy of attending such an event. And I would assume it's my due diligence as the inviter to the invitee to verify that this person is in good faith to be able to come into the chamber. Would you say that is correct?
I mean, that was always our assumption to date, that the parties did their own vetting and that we would just be responsible for physical security vetting.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau, 2 minutes et demie.
Oui. Ce qu'on a vécu, c'est un désastre. On est tous conscients.
Okay, so it was quite a disaster, but you mentioned that the speaker introduced or recognized Mr. Hunka, but you were unaware of the background. If you don't know, it's not. You are not to be criticized for that. You didn't have the time to conduct open source complete risk analysis, so you have no responsibility for this. Mr. Rota chose his guest, and he advised you of that, and you checked it through security, etc. Now, the Prime Minister invited Mr. Hunka to an event in Toronto. Now, you're saying that if the Prime Minister invited the individual, it's the same situation as Mr. Rota. I mean, he made a choice to invite Mr. Hunka. Was Mr. Rota not just a sacrificial lamb thrown under the bus? What? Or you don't know? For this event in Toronto, the administration of Parliament was not involved in that in any way whatsoever. How it arose that he ended up being invited there, we have no clue, and we know nothing about it and are not involved. Well, if there is a sort of a security process for the Prime Minister, is there no exchange of information or any red flag is raised that, there's going to be an event even if it's in Toronto? Well, I know that between Parliamentary Protocol Office and the PMO, there's a lot of communications, yes. But as for invitees list or guest list, we were not informed in any way of a guest list for that event in Toronto. So the only time that they inform us is if they invite specific other individuals, and we have to get in touch with their offices, MPs, for example. Well, it's very, very significant information for us. What happened from the day that the Speaker Rota resigned and the next day? I mean, what happened exactly? We'd really like to know what the correspondences were at that point. Well, we passed a motion for documents. We haven't received anything from the bloc, and if you have the motions, you have to have them in both official languages. I think we had set a deadline, and I don't think now is the time to an individual document formally request the tabling or the obtention of documents. If you were going to make this request, you should have prepared a motion, I think.
It's your second referral to documents, but I do understand that we've had a motion passed. I understand we've received documents, and so I just want to make sure all members are there. Mr. Berthold?
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Chair. If those who are responsible for the documents, if they're prepared to provide the information, I think it's a very legitimate request. If they can produce the documents, we don't really have to insist.
You received them, so I believe they have done that work for it. So once again, I'm just going to get us through this meeting, and I'm just putting on record what we do know and what we don't know, but members can always determine that. 2.5 minutes to Ms. Matheson.
Just final clarification, I think, on what Ms. Goudreau was talking about. So when it was discussed, I think Ms. Ansel, you had said that each of the parties have the list that they submit. They are separate to protocol. You said that the speaker then separated those, or he had a list of the people. That, as a member of the Liberal Party, technically, but he's not seen that way when he's a speaker. So he has a separate list entirely. So then when the same, when Mr. Hunka was invited to the PMO's event in Toronto, that would have had to have been Mr. Rhoda sending that list separately as a member or as the speaker to the PMO, to that separate event, in a separate function, in a separate email, in a separate view.
I do not know how the Prime Minister's office obtained the name of Mr. Hunka. That I could not let you know. I know it's not through us. Yeah. And you're correct in saying that he has a list separate. So in terms of who has a number of guests to be invited, the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Speaker of the Senate, each have a number of guests that they invite. So they have a separate list.
And just with the small amount of time I have left, you had mentioned previously that role of protocol office is firewalled. Could you explain that a bit further? Can you just expand on that for me?
I'm not sure exactly what you mean by firewall.
Sorry, and that was the wording of the translator. So maybe it didn't come through, but it said that your role within the Office of Protocol is firewalled to protect, I guess, that division and that separation of with the list and everything.
Yes, that the list. Yes, their list. We collate the list together.
Yeah. So could you expand on like the importance of that and why you would want to preserve that, or maybe that needs to change?
It really is for each party to feel free to be able to invite who they want, and it's their own prerogative to put people on the guest list. Same thing from the Prime Minister's office and the Speaker as well.
Okay. And so when we were talking about potentially parties for that reputational risk assessment, sharing lists, how does that interfere in terms of, I guess, that separation of lists or reputational risk assessment? How does that interfere
I think what
with
Mr.
that
Jens was
firewalling?
referring to was more for a small number of people that would be, for example, seated in the speaker's gallery. That would be the people that would have more of an active role or be recognized. So that's part of that.
Not those
small
larger
group
lists.
would not be part of those 500 guests.
Excellent. Thank you. We're going to just end this panel off with 2 minutes to Mr. Cooper, suivi par 2 minutes à Mr. Lauzon. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. To Madame Anctil, I just want to press you a little bit on the sharing of lists. You stated that protocol receives lists from groups of invitees, but those lists are not shared. And I accept that. But I would press you insofar as we have in the limited documents that have been produced to this committee a text message on September 20th from the Prime Minister's Outreach Advisor to the Parliamentary Protocol Coordinator with respect to an invitee on the Conservative list stating, received an invite and she shouldn't have. She's not on my list. She shouldn't have been invited. She's not on my list. So it would seem to me, based upon that text, that the Prime Minister's office did have names that were not on the Prime Minister's list.
What my team sent you the screenshot of the message you're referring to, and what I've been told is that was the only message sent. There's no list attached to that. My thinking is it could be that it's a person that has knowledge of people in the Prime Minister's office and had mentioned that she might have been invited to the event. Because
Well, it's certainly interesting and raises questions, that's for sure, but I'll press on that. 1 minute left. I just, in terms of, we heard that this was a very rushed event. How many days did you have to prepare, and what would be the normal time frame? Say, for example, when President Biden visited Parliament Hill.
I would say that the last 3 addresses were done in a rush time, every single one of them. So that seems to have been the norm since the end of the pandemic.
Excellent. And rush, you're talking about days, weeks?
Weeks without an S. So
Okay.
1 week, a week and a half.
Okay.
The type of preparation.
Of
Yes.
giving you notice. Okay. Monsieur Lauzon, 2 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. And quite quickly, Mr. Jantz, perhaps you could explain why reputational risk is not analyzed or evaluated. And it might be quite a risk to invite such a person for the government's reputation. It's not part of our mandate when we organize events for Parliament. We have a protocol office, we got a security office, and we're looking at security risk to either an MP, a senator, or the establishment itself of Parliament. We don't have the resources, or usually we rarely have the time to do an in-depth analysis of all risks. Well, I have very little time. I've learned a lot today on the procedure and the protocols. We're here to learn. We want to know what happened also. Now, for the record, the Speaker invites a Canadian citizen. He's been a citizen since the 1950s. The guest list is transmitted or provided by the Speaker to your security unit for verification or security check and analysis, security analysis with standard protocols in place. And nothing indicated that this individual was a threat to the government. The lists are not shared, the event occurs, and well, what happened. We recognize one individual who was called out for reputational factors. Given this experience, should you not be adding reputational risk to your factors to protect the government, if not individuals? Well, as was mentioned, perhaps we should be looking at individuals for reputational risk if these individuals are going to be recognized formally in the event.
Say thank you so much for your time. You've had a lot of exchanges, and obviously there's a desire to receive information so that this committee can do its work. And I will just ask you that if there are insights and information that you can provide, that the committee would appreciate it, please through the clerk. Also, as you had exchanges and questions and answers, if something comes to mind to say, I wish I had added this information, it would be a great opportunity for you to provide our committee that information. If you provided it to the clerk, we will make sure it's circulated around. Sometimes, I'm sure you'll be thinking about this for days to come. Something might come to light and to say, you know what, maybe I'll share this, and then we would appreciate that information. Ms. Romanado?
Mr. Jantz mentioned that he had circulated his opening remarks to the interpreters. If there's any way that we could get a copy, it would be great. Thank you.
Yes. In future, we would love to receive them as well when the interpreters do. But yes, we'll make sure we get a copy of those and through the clerk and circulated. All right. So that I wish you all a great day. Thank you for your time and attention. We will be starting our next panel in the next 2 minutes at 12:35 with the House Leader, Stephen McKinnon. Thank you so much. Have a good day. and 6. We have with us the Honorable Stephen McKinnon, Leader of the Government in the House of Commons. Minister McKinnon, you will have up to 10 minutes for your opening comments. Please feel free not to use all of those 10 minutes. But if you would like to, you have 10 minutes. At 10 minutes, you'll hear a beep, 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 and I will respectfully cut you off. So hopefully we don't get to that. And we're really grateful that you turned around your invitation to come so quickly. We know that's not easy to do, but it does mean a lot to all members at Procedures and House Affairs. So thank you. Welcome.
Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente, et merci à...
I thank you, Madam Chair, and I thank all the other colleagues and parliamentarians for the invitation. I'm here to discuss with you what happened last September, where His Excellency Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the House. It was a historic day for us all. His address allowed us to reinforce our indisputable support for the Ukraine. Ukraine was then fighting and continuing to fight today for their sovereignty, for this illegal intrusion on their territory by the Russians. Putin's Russia is a very, very momentous moment, because if Ukraine falls, we will have very serious consequences. Canadians have to set aside their partisanry and present a single front of solidarity with the Ukrainians. Unfortunately, this event was stained by a very unfortunate event, particularly harmful to Canadians, but particularly to our Jewish Canadians. This man was recognized by the Speaker as a hero. He was applauded by all the MPs in the House, no matter what their political membership. We did not know that individual's history during the Second World War, and yet we were called upon to give him a recognition.
Examining how this unfortunate incident happened, let me review the chronology of what occurred in the days that followed President Zelensky's address. The address in the House chamber, of course, occurred on a Friday. Over the weekend, details about the individual's involvement in the Second World War emerged. On the Sunday evening, then Speaker Rota issued a statement. He wrote, and I quote, "On Friday, September 22nd, in my remarks following the address of the President of Ukraine, I recognized an individual in the gallery. I have subsequently become aware of more information which causes me to regret my decision to do so. I wish to make clear that no one, including fellow parliamentarians and the Ukraine delegation, was aware of my intention or of my remarks before I delivered them. This initiative was entirely my own, the individual in question being from my riding and having been brought to my attention. I particularly want to extend my deepest apologies to Jewish communities in Canada and around the world. I accept full responsibility for my actions." Unquote. That was the explanation from the Speaker. It was concise. He made it clear that he alone was behind the decision to invite the individual to the House. The next morning, on Monday, the Speaker rose in the chamber and delivered a similar statement to members of Parliament. He said, quote, "I wish to apologize to the House. I am deeply sorry that I have offended many with my gesture and remarks," unquote. Notwithstanding his clear statement and his apology, there were questions raised by the opposition over whether the government was involved in the invitation to the House. The Speaker intervened in the proceedings and said clearly, quote, "I just want to make it clear that it was my decision and my decision alone. This was a constituent who wanted to be here, and I recognized him. It was my decision, and I apologize profusely. I cannot tell members how regretful it is, which may not be good enough for some of you, and for that, I apologize." Unquote. Chair, as you will recall, despite Speaker Rota's explanation and apology, members expressed significant concerns about his actions in this regard. The next day, on Tuesday, September 26th, he rose in the House to announce his resignation as Speaker. He reiterated his profound regret for his error. He said it had caused pain to individuals and communities, including the Jewish community in Canada and around the world. Speaker Rota said, quote, "I accept full responsibility for my actions," unquote. Again, his words were clear and definitive. Several months later, his explanation has not changed. In a letter he wrote to this committee, January 30th, he wrote, quote, I reiterate that the decision to invite the person was mine, as was the decision to recognize him in my remarks, unquote. Madame la Présidente, en finissant et en
Madam Chair, to conclude, it's important to stress the context of what happened on that Friday. The former speaker clearly indicated that he was solely responsible. It was his initiative, and no other member of the House played a role in that. No one was aware that this individual was going to be present in the House. The former speaker had his list for this address, which was determined by himself or his office alone. Following this horrible incident that happened, the Prime Minister recognized how painful this was for Canadian community as a whole and Jewish community in particular, and spoke with various members in the House. Speaker Rota issued the invitation, recognizing the individual in the gallery, and assumed full responsibility. No MP, he stayed, was aware of it. The Prime Minister has also said, on behalf of all those present in the House, I offer my apologies for what happened during the address or following the address of Premier Zelensky. The fact that having honored this individual without knowing who he was a terrible error, a violation of those who suffered cruelly by the Nazi regime.
About what I would like to briefly offer some remarks. I'm here to work cooperatively, of course, with all my colleagues to discuss what occurred in the House last September. However, I expect some of the committee members might plan to ask questions about another separate event that also occurred during that week. When President Zelensky visited Canada, there was a community event in Toronto for him with over 1,000 people invited. Hundreds of Canadians were invited upon the recommendation of community groups. The name of the individual we are discussing in these proceedings was submitted by the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Ultimately, the person did not attend the event. It is important to emphasize that these two events, the evening gathering in Toronto and the address on the floor of the House in Ottawa, were two entirely separate events. The final point to remember, Chair, is after this unfortunate incident occurred, our government left no doubt about where Canada stands in its unwavering support for Ukraine. The Prime Minister said our country stands alongside Ukraine in its fight against Vladimir Putin's brutality, lies, and violence. He paid tribute to the sacrifices of Ukrainians as they fight for their democracy, their freedom, their language and culture, and for peace. The Prime Minister also publicly anticipated that this incident would be politicized and turned into false propaganda by Russia to weaken Ukraine. Not surprisingly, Putin himself has continued with these efforts in recent days in an interview in Russia with far-right American conservative pundit Tucker Carlson. But the facts speak otherwise. Canadians won't be fooled by this irresponsible and mischievous propaganda. Canada and Ukraine are allies. Our resolve to support Ukraine at this crucial time is no less strong now than it was then. These are the facts of what happened last September. The Speaker at the time made a mistake for which he was solely responsible. He accepted that responsibility and stepped down. But we cannot and will not allow this to define our relationship with Ukraine. The people of Ukraine are our friends, and at this time of peril in their history, they need our friendship. We will not let them down. I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you for those comments, and thank you for providing me back a minute and a half. We will enter into 6-minute rounds, starting with 6 minutes through the chair. We are colleague to colleague, so if we can have respectful dialogue, I will obviously provide some leniency. If there is people speaking over people, I will do what I do and remind you that we don't do that. So 6 minutes to Mr. Cooper, followed by 6 minutes to Mr. Gerritsen, suivi par 6 minutes à Madame Goudreau, et puis à Madame Matheson. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Minister McKinnon, when the former SS soldier was invited and recognized in Parliament during the address of President Zelensky, you were the chief government whip. You are now the government House Leader. We have since learned that Justin Trudeau sent an invitation to this very same SS soldier 3 days before the address of the President of Ukraine to his exclusive reception in Toronto with none other than the President of Ukraine, President Zelensky. So, on behalf of Justin Trudeau's government, will you apologize for what ought to be a significant embarrassment on the part of the government to have invited an SS soldier to this exclusive reception?
Point of order. Madam Chair, we're clearly, talking about the incident that occurred in the House of Commons. That's what the study is about and the impacts of it. I understand that there might be some questions that stray, just partially outside the line, but now we're into a line of questioning that has absolutely nothing to do with our study. Is the entire line of questioning going to be outside the scope of what we're studying? And if so, why don't we do a separate study on the issue that Mr. Cooper is suggesting?
So, what I will say is that I think we all know what the purpose of procedure in House Affairs is. We also know that based on comments that are provided, there are leniency as to where questions can unfold and go to be. So I think when some doors for lines of questioning are open, then there will be some gray area. I think the minister is capable of answering such concerns and questions. And if he's not, so your point is noted, Mr. Gerritsen.
I have another point of order when you're done.
I would really appreciate that we get to the end of this meeting. So I'm going to say that within some leniency, that comment and concern can be permissible. Mr. Gerritsen.
Fair. But again, on a point of order, we're here to ask witnesses, like we did very respectfully in the first panel, of information in order to provide content for our report. Mr. Cooper is asking for, not only is he entertaining discussion outside of the scope of the work, he's literally asking the witness now for something that has nothing to do with the actual report. He's asking him to apologize for something which has nothing to do with the report. So I just want to understand if we're going to be spending the next hour in this manner or if we're going to actually be trying to contribute to the report.
I would hope that Mr. Cooper now will want to respond. Yes, Mr. Cooper.
Well, Madam Chair, it absolutely is pertinent. This is a prime minister who claimed he knew nothing about this individual. We now learn that he sent an invite to the very same SS soldier 3 days before the address of the President of Ukraine. And I asked the government House Leader a very simple question: will he apologize on behalf of the government? I would hope the answer would be yes.
And so good news. As members of this committee, we get to ask questions. We do not get to predetermine what the answers are, but I'm sure the minister looks forward to answering it. I am going to ask us to remember why we are here. And based on why we are here, I would like us to continue having a respectful exchange. And I would like us to come to the conclusion of this meeting as quickly as possible so I can start looking forward to Thursday's meeting. So with that, I'm going to restart the clock, you're not starting from the top, but your time of 1 minute for your question remains. And I'm going to give the floor to Minister McKinnon. I am confident there will be no more interruptions. And I'm also confident that Minister McKinnon will be brief in his response so that Mr. Cooper can continue with his line of questioning. Minister McKinnon.
What I said in my remarks is that the Prime Minister had offered his apology in the House upon learning, outside the House, upon learning of the error that was made by the Speaker, and spoke, I think, through the forum that was offered him to our visitors. Indeed, we've acknowledged that this was a terribly embarrassing incident for Canada, and I think that stands for itself.
Prime Minister only acknowledged the invitation of this former SS soldier after he got caught, after it was reported by the media, several months after the fact. Why did the Prime Minister hide this fact from Canadians?
I'm not sure I accept the premise of the question that he hid anything.
The premise of the question is very simple. There's a list of invitees from the Prime Minister. That comes from his office. It included this former SS soldier. He has said he knew nothing about this individual. He had no knowledge, no involvement, nothing whatsoever. And now we learn through the media that, in fact, his office, 3 days before, sent an invite to this individual. So again, why did the Prime Minister withhold this material fact from Canadians about his office's involvement with this former SS soldier?
As I think you acknowledged, Mr. Cooper, I was the Chief Government Whip. I'm here to discuss what I understand to have been the process that led to and ensued from the events in Parliament that day. The fact is that an error was committed. The Speaker acknowledged that error, took responsibility for that error, paid arguably a very high price for that error. We were all embarrassed by that. I think I speak for all parliamentarians in expressing our embarrassment for that event. The Prime Minister himself expressed his regrets and apologies to President Zelensky.
He expressed his apologies in respect of his invite to of a former SS officer after he got caught. And speaking of the former Speaker, yes, the Prime Minister threw the former Speaker under the bus. And the Prime Minister said he did the right thing in resigning upon inviting and recognizing a former SS soldier. Why one standard for the former Speaker who the Prime Minister threw under the bus and not the same standard for the Prime Minister who invited this very same former SS soldier to an exclusive reception where, had he attended, he could have very easily accessed or would have been within feet of President Zelensky?
This former Speaker stood in his place, acknowledged the presence of a person whose background that no one was aware of that day. I was there that day. I assume you were there that day. The past history of this gentleman was unknown to us all. The fact that he would be recognized was unknown to us all. And the Speaker took his own initiative to invite this person to the speech, which was a decision that was made by the Speaker and solely by the Speaker. So that's what I can comment on here, and I think the appropriate apologies, starting with the former Speaker, continuing with the Prime Minister and others, have been made. And I think sometimes, Mr. Cooper, when something...
Okay, so I'm going to actually interrupt both of you fine gentlemen. For the last 53 seconds remaining, I provided a lot of leniency. I will remind us all that we are at the Procedure and House Affairs Committee. As somebody who lives about an hour away from Toronto, I feel like they receive a lot of attention. I would like us to resituate ourselves to the House of Commons in the nation's capital so that this committee can do its work. So I do believe I've demonstrated a lot of leniency, and I would just like us to get back to the study and the work that we're here to do within your last 53 seconds, Mr. Cooper.
The Prime Minister threw the former Speaker under the bus. He took no responsibility. He covered up the fact that his office sent an invite to this former SS soldier. So, through you, Madam Chair, to Mr. McKinnon, I'll ask the question I posed to you at the start of my round. Will you apologize on behalf of the government for this outrageous invite?
Well, I reject the premise, unfortunately, Mr. Cooper, of your question. And
stand by the invitation.
Of course, what I said in my initial.
You have no shame.
What? Oh my heavens!
Point of order. Point of order.
Mr. Gerritsen.
Madam Speaker, the rules of the House of Commons and what happens in our chamber extend to committee. And to suggest that a member is not honorable by saying you have no shame is certainly out of order in our chamber, and therefore it would certainly be out of order in this room. I would kindly request that Mr. Cooper withdraw that comment and apologize to the witness.
I withdraw. Are you not embarrassed that you won't give an unequivocal
Okay,
apology?
so
on the
I
part
think
of the
this is
government?
where I really do believe in the work this committee does. And I think what happens is that I really take my role seriously as the chair of this committee, believe it or not. And I think you do all take turns at trying to compromise the work that I do. And it makes it very awkward and it makes it very difficult. And I will just let you know that I do not appreciate it. So if we can just continue to carry ourselves with the regard that I know we can, we are by default honorable members. We don't even have to prove it. We just get that title. So let's just be that title for the dozens of people who are watching. So I do think Mr. Cooper recognized and did retract those comments. We'll leave it at that. The last 17 seconds will be yours, Mr. Minister McKinnon, to respond, and I will be moving on to Mr. Gerritsen.
I said, I think, what I can say and understand to be the case about the incident to which you refer. Suffice to say, Mr. Cooper, I fully put to you that the Government of Canada has expressed its extreme regret for the error that the Speaker made, the former Speaker.
Mr. Gerritsen.
I guess the precedent has been set by Mr. Cooper, but just out of curiosity, Mr. McKinnon, have you ever given a TV interview with, in the background, there being a flag with a swastika drawn on it?
Not to my knowledge.
Unfortunately, that can't be said for all members that sit at this
Point of
table.
order, Madam
But,
Speaker. I can't.
Point of order, Mr. Berthold.
Je veux juste rappeler Monsieur Garrett.
I'd just like to remind Mr. Garrison that he's not going to preach at us here. There is a purpose for staying on track and on theme of this committee. I think, you were recommending that we stick to the project. Let's do so.
That's now come up in. I'm going to have to provide the same leniency. And that's where I always say when we do want to say that there's a certain grayness of asking questions. If we focused on the study and the work of the Procedure and House Affairs Committee, it would be a lot easier for all of us. But now that we are referring to interviews that people are having with media, and it sounds like that's what Mr. Gerritsen is doing, I'm going to hope that he's going to demonstrate relevance to get us back to the study. And I'm sure Mr. Gerritsen will offer me that courtesy to you the floor.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I certainly tried to bring us to relevance during Mr. Cooper's comments. However, I was unsuccessful, and he's now set a precedent. But in any event, you concluded your comments, Mr. McKinnon, by saying that the government stands unequivocally with Ukraine. Is that true?
Absolutely. The government.
Can you say the same thing for all 338 members of Parliament?
Well, I think if one were weighing international impacts, I would say that the decision by certain parliamentarians to not support the renewed Canada-Ukraine free trade arrangements has certainly echoed around the world, around allies, far more than this incident ever did. And that Ukrainians in Canada and Ukrainians in Ukraine have reason to doubt that there is unanimity in the Canadian Parliament with respect to support for Ukraine and repelling Russian aggression. It is an illegal war, I remind all members, and it is one that is a moral cause. It is a just cause, and it is one that deserves our support by default.
Yeah, and I mean, I couldn't agree more. The reality of the situation is here, Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, is that I only wish that the Conservative Party of Canada could have given as much attention to this particular, to Ukraine generally speaking, as they've chosen to give to this particular issue, because there are trying to use an unfortunate situation to exploit political gain. The reality is, Madam Speaker, is that we know that Conservatives have continually and routinely shown themselves to not support Ukraine. As a matter of fact, just during this event that occurred in the House of Commons, I'm not even sure if you're aware of this, Mr. McKinnon. You can tell me if you are or if you aren't. But the leader of the opposition never issued a single social media post about President Zelensky appearing in Parliament. Not before, not after, not to show any degree or level of support whatsoever. Were you aware of that?
Well, I think that was noted by several commentators, unbiased commentators. I myself was sitting in close proximity to, of course, Mr. Zelensky and the leader of the opposition, and couldn't help but note the tepid applause that was offered that day. I know that was an inspiring day for parliamentarians from all sides of the House. I personally left the House of Commons that day extremely inspired, proud of my country for what it's doing and what it continues to do to support our Ukrainian friends and allies. And
so were you surprised, Mr. McKinnon, when the leader of the official opposition didn't even bother to issue a single tweet saying thank you to a president who traveled across the globe, whose country is currently at war against a dictator who has no regard for democracy whatsoever? Were you equally as surprised as I was and am that he chose not to issue a single statement on it, yet the moment that this issue arose, he used every single opportunity to exploit this, as Conservatives continue to do today, for political advantage?
I was very surprised. I recall thinking to myself that this may be a precursor sign of what we're observing around the world in some conservative parties, that support for Ukraine and the moral cause that it represents is flagging among conservatives, and that this was a cause for concern. I think that was confirmed, as we all now know, later during the debate on the free trade arrangements, where we saw, conservatives break from a Canadian consensus with respect to support for Ukraine, economic support, military support, diplomatic support, and that is something that I think we all should remain concerned about. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. McKinnon. I believe that wraps up my time, Madam Chair.
Left.
I'll turn the last minute to Ms. Ramanel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Minister McKinnon, for being here. In the previous panel, the clerk mentioned that currently, procedurally, the list of categories to recognize individuals in the Speaker's Gallery does not actually apply to joint address. And we had gone through the list of joint addresses to Parliament, dating back to 1940. There have been instances where people in the gallery or in the audience have been referenced in a speech, but not actually formally recognized by a speaker. Given the fact that you are the government House leader and sit on the Board of Internal Economy and speak with the other leaders of the official oppositions, do you think that this is something that we should be putting in practice? It's not part of the standing orders, but as part of the procedural and practice, do you recommend that going forward that could be a recommendation for us?
I know that generally that the House administration, the Speaker's office, are continuing to work on guidelines and best practices with respect to joint addresses. I think we also all live under this rebuke that we get from time to time that we not, as members, recognize members in the gallery. And that the Speaker be the sole person able to do so.
Thank you.
So we're going to be working on that, and I look forward to participating in that.
Madame Goudreau, 6 minutes.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Bon, on a
Thank you, Chair. We talked about guest lists, and there's a Canadian aspect here, not only for Zelensky, but for Canada. But we've talked about the protocol this morning. I'd like to raise the incidents and the repercussion as a diplomatic incident. So who can be ultimately accountable? Was it the security people? How could a Nazi soldier who found refuge in Canada and find himself in the middle of this situation? Well, thank you, Madame Goudreau, for your question. I was the government whip at the time. A little bit on the margins of what was going on. The best that I know is that Speaker Rota submitted a list of invitees, guests. He didn't consult anyone on that, as far as I know. He didn't show that to, well, perhaps some of his staffers would have seen the names in the list, yes. But he's completely within his rights as Speaker of a House to invite a certain number of individuals to any event, special event or ceremony, such as the address by His Excellency Zelensky. Now, I have no direct knowledge of it, but I assume that that list was, in fact, submitted to the security unit for screening, security screening. And he passed the test. The name was not red flagged in any way. And there's no central authority that examines the political leanings of our citizens here. No, but a Google search would let you find something, and you should be raising a red flag. Well, to come back to the previous question, perhaps these are among the elements that should be examined by the security unit or the House of Commons, but the government isn't here to refuse or not refuse visitors on a list. Well, when the Speaker has a list of invitees, would you not be aware of it? In this case, I wasn't, and in many other cases, I would not be. No. And I'm telling you this with a certain era of detachment because I wasn't House Leader at the time. I was whip. Well, how can it be that this terrible situation, as the Prime Minister said, and the Speaker as well, who fully accepted his accountability, took several days. It was the 26th of September. What happened between the 22nd and the 26th? I don't see what you're getting at. Well, with one accepts responsibility, one responds immediately. Now, time went by, things were percolating in the media, and what happened in the interim? You know, we were looking for the flaw, the fault, the responsibility. I am not to be a judge of the circumstance that may or may not have happened in the reasoning that the Speaker had to resign. But he came to the conclusion that he had lost the confidence of the House. This very painful event, a sad conclusion that he came to, but we can be empathetic towards the Speaker, the ex-Speaker. Well, I think what happened in this process is that Mr. Process, he became the sacrificial lamb, scapegoat. Because it's not the Speaker who heads the whole establishment of Parliament, the institution. But when I hear and when we see in the media that 3 years prior, that individual was on the Prime Minister's guest list, Now, that list came from somewhere, so they should have perhaps checked the open source on the Prime Minister's list. Now, the whole context, you have to take a step back. No, I can't agree with you, Madame Goudreau. The Prime Minister does not check on the reputation of every person on your guest list. Every member is entitled, and a member is free to invite a certain number, a limited number, but a certain number of individuals. Free choice. So it's not really treated all that seriously. Then no, I can't agree with that, but I don't agree with the premise of your question. Well, I don't understand that how could have happened. How could it have happened? Well, we don't have the thought police here yet in our society, particularly not within the confines of our parliamentary democracy. And we have to consider as much as possible to ensure security. And I think that Mr. Rota clearly indicated full responsibility for his choices and his choices alone.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. A lot of conversations were happening in terms of the fact that in the earlier panel, the fact that the speaker's list was entirely independent of the government's list of those invited and so on, and those actions were independent. One of the roles of the speaker, of course, and the importance of that independence is key. The jurisdiction of the House. You agree with that entirely?
Absolutely.
Okay. So in some of the documents that our committee received related to the incident, there was correspondence between your office, the House Leader's office, and the Speaker's office following the breaking news about the Hunka affair. And it seems as though steps were taken by your office to oversee the Speaker's official response and the speech. So considering there is supposed to be that clear independence and that clean boundary, what guidance did your office give the speaker in the build-up to his resignation and that apology speech? And how does that work in terms of that independence that you just spoke of?
Was the verb you used oversee? If it was, that's not a word I would associate with this. I think an inquiry was made by the Government House Leader's office of the Speaker's office to ensure that they were aware of and seized with the breaking news about that emerged over that weekend.
Okay, but again, in terms of the back and forth, there was communications between each offices. So you say that it was solely that concern. There was no guidance. There was no oversight provided.
I think there was an urgency expressed and a verification made to ensure that they were aware of this issue and taking action in response to it.
Okay. So in those documents that I referred to, as soon as the news about the Hunka affair was revealed, political staff in those communications, they changed from writing emails and sending text to making phone calls. So that would show that there was an potential concern about what was being communicated. Now that also shows a concern to me in terms of the transparency of the situation for us to be able to do that work in this committee. So what do you think that says in terms of about the commitment to the principles of that transparency if everything all of a sudden just stopped and everything went to phone calls?
What I would say is I don't think you should assume the worst. I think you should assume that a member of the Government House Leader's office was concerned about the news story that was emerging, ensuring that the Speaker's office was going to react to that. And I think the public record speaks to what ensued. And I don't think there is that much distance between the ensuring that things were going to get done or reacted to that afternoon and or that day, and when the Speaker put out a statement, the first statement.
What we've seen from the official opposition, of course, is a belief that way more has happened and that there's way more here at play. Do you believe that ultimately that lack of transparency fuels that fire?
If you're asking me to offer a political analysis about why the official opposition acts like it does,
No, not necessarily. It's more though in terms of that lack of transparency that seems to have occurred here as a problem overall.
I think the opposition's a little sheepish about their lack of support for Ukraine in the trade deal. Perhaps the tepid welcome that they offered Mr. Zelensky that day themselves, and are trying to create diversion.
Wow, I've certainly seen that in my other committees. So
yeah,
I'll give you that. In terms of, let's just change pace then. In terms of the aftermath of this incident, of course, this is having a great deal of impact on communities, the Jewish community in Canada, of course. And in a meeting that I've had with them in my local area, of course, they have been calling for, many communities have been calling for the bringing forward from your government of the online hate legislation. It was promised within 100 days of your government coming to power, and we have not seen that. I would ask what consideration is your government given, considering this incredible incident, considering the harm that's been done, and considering the fact that groups like the Jewish community have called for this, for your government to come forward with that actual piece of legislation that you've been well overdue on?
Well, thank you for the question. I know that on multiple occasions, the fact that the Jewish community had a right to feel especially hurt by this incident was singled out, and apologies were offered, and I know that continues to be the case, that we are horrified by the impact of this incident on the Jewish community, and I think we all need to remain humble in the face of that. With respect to the anti-hate legislation, I would just point you to the minister and the fact that remains a significant commitment of this government, and I won't, beyond that, I won't say much more.
Thank you.
Except, stay tuned.
Thank you. I would just say that we just swim further and further from the topic when we talk about legislation. So I do think when somebody comes and provides comments and they open up a little bit of the scope, that there is some ability to exchange. But when the person who's appearing has not even opened up that scope, I do think as members we need to try to stay within the purpose of why we're here. So I'll just give that as a friendly reminder. I did not want to interrupt the exchange, but I would just remind everyone as to the purpose of the study and why we're here. And if we can just try to swim in that pool, it would be really appreciated. Monsieur Berthold, 5 minutes, suivi par Monsieur Lauzon. Monsieur Berthold.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Will you continue? Would you repeat? Are you continuing to contend that the Prime Minister and the members of his cabinet didn't know that Mr. Hunka was in the public gallery or the gallery at the time of the address? Well, I can only repeat what this former Speaker Rota had said, a solemn when he resigned, that he was solely alone in the responsibility, assumed all responsibility for that. No one in the Prime Minister's office knew that Mr. Hunka was in the gallery. The Speaker has been absolutely clear that he was the sole and unique person responsible for the addition of Mr. Hunka on that list. Well, I'm not getting a direct answer to my question, but how can you explain that on the 24th of September, a few hours after the revelation that Mr. Hunka was an SS officer, there was a texto that went to the parliamentary secretary saying, what's the name of his son? I'm not sure. 24th of September, a few moments after we learned that Mr. Juncker was a former Nazi. From the outreach officer of PM's office asked for the name of the individual. Well, I can't. I was the whip, government whip at the time, and I really can't answer that. After that, the speaker recognized, it was after that we had learned that Mr. Juncker was a former Nazi. I don't know why, in the light of everything that happened, I don't know why she would wanted to know that piece of information. I mean, you know, I'm not expecting the worst, but no, I'm not expecting the worst, but it's just bizarre. It's just strange. Not a communications officer, but an outreach officer in the PM's office. His son was also there, I believe, so they wanted to know his name. Well, it might have, if you want to speculate, I mean, perhaps given what had happened, she wanted to get a little bit more information of what happened. Well, I see that you're absolutely not aware of that communication, perhaps, but it's striking that someone from the PM's office should go out looking for the name of the son of this Mr. Juncker. Now, is the whip not the House leader in a sense as to the activities that goes on in the House? Well, I'm sure that notice was given to all MPs in the House. It was very short notice. If memory serves, I think it was a Tuesday or the Wednesday of that week prior to the Friday event. Who provided a list? Somebody sent a list to the authorities of the House of Commons. One of my big frustrations as whip was not to be able to accommodate all the requests of my colleagues. Just a minute. No, Mr. McKinnon, I'm asking you, who supplied the list? I'm trying to answer your question, sir. If the government bears the responsibility, the burden of who is going to be mentioned in the speaker's response, who supplied the list? Why can you not inform us of that?
The member opposite appreciates immensely the work of the translators, and when people are speaking over each other, the translators cannot do the important work that they do. So I ask that the member opposite allow the minister to finish his question and then pose his. Merci.
I will take that as a reminder to remind everyone to make sure one person is speaking at a time so that we can know what's being said in both official languages. Minister McKinnon.
Je vais répondre à sa question.
Oui, qui? Shall I answer the question? As a whip, I don't know. I don't know who sent the list. But no, that you don't know who supplied the list. So you cannot be held accountable for that list. But this event was organized by the Prime Minister's cabinet. The member from Winnipeg North requested that this event occur. He requested the approval of the House to go forward with the session.
And it was a very exciting 5 minutes and 30 seconds. Monsieur Lauzon, 5 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci de votre présence.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your attendance, Mr. McKinnon. Always a pleasure to see you. I think you have explained very, very clearly the situation, and even if it was the Speaker of the House and his response. Thank you for reminding us of our consistent and persistent support for Ukraine. Our purpose here is to try to find a solution so that this situation never repeats itself in the House again. Now, your role as whip at the time of the incident, there are all the protocols were explained quite clearly with this plethora of witnesses that we had this morning. And among all those procedures, at what point should you be intervening in a joint event? You attempted an answer that what is your role limited to when we have a joint event with senators? Well, thank you, Mr. Lauzon. I'm glad to be here and discuss with you. There's a very limited number of space in the gallery, in the gallery of the House. The number of seats attributed to the various political formations, Bloc Québécois, perhaps in the Senate to the Independent and the Greens, I don't know. But I've always been told that for addresses such as that pronounced by Excellency Zelensky, I'm a firm believer in proportional allotment of seats to all political parties, etc. We have to. There's some people that you have to invite, diplomats accredited because of their role or their position, which limits the other available seats. And I've often received comments, if not complaints, that typical opposition member could have more chances to invite a larger number of individuals to these events than a backbencher on the government side, because of the way that the allocation is made proportionately. So your role is limited to that then. So if we're talking about this infamous list, we've heard from a number of witnesses that the list was shared or transmitted to the security unit for vetting. Did you see that list in order to work with the protocol? I've never had access to any individual list, and that's not my understanding of how the system works. Well, all right. So the transmission of that list was sent following the security protocol. Your team, as a whip, did you have to ensure any security in that list? None whatsoever. None whatsoever. So we all deplore the situation that we lived through in the House of Commons. There was a situation that no parliamentarian would ever want to face, no matter how long his career. It was just extremely regrettable, and we are all feeling a bit bad about it as a country. But some people want to draw benefit from that. That's the unfortunate part. We heard echoes of this in Russia from the lips of Putin himself. What impact would this have internationally, that this situation is being used for partisan purposes? Well, the impact is a lot worse when a party in the House refused to vote in support of the trade agreement with Ukraine. That's my evaluation of the situation. I think that puts in doubt the unanimous and solid support for Ukraine. Thank you. 2.5 minutes. This list, I mean, the whips were aware of lists. It came from the Prime Minister's office. You didn't see it. Obviously, the PMO had a list of its own, and they used it. No? Yes, there was a list. But I think everything we've heard this morning confirms that it's an isolated process. I understand, Madame Bellefeuille there. I know. But the members of the cabinet, I wasn't there, but I think that the protocol office, and do they speak with the office, the staff of the Speaker? Well, you had the opportunity to ask that question of the representatives that were here earlier. Oh, on day one. You know, if you realize and recognize your responsibility, well, that's where you resign. You don't wait a few days and discuss or whatever. What happened? What went on? What was the community trying to save the Speaker? Well, what happened in private is in private, and if what happens in public, it's in public. But you have to, despite the error which he assumed full accountability for, I must tell this committee that Speaker Rota is an honorable man. He's served his country well, and I think that we're going after him and criticizing for an error, a human error. He paid the price, and he's going to have to wear it for a long time. Don't you think that I have so much respect for Mr. Rota, who is an honorable general, exemplar in his performance as Speaker. But this is why I want information. Well, if you're concerned about his honor, he offered explanations. He repeated them several times. And if you believe that he's an honorable person, as I do, you'll agree with me, Madame Goudreau, that there's nothing fishy going on here. He recognized his error, if you will, and he apologized for it sincerely. And to continue flogging this dead horse, I don't think it's dignified. Well, I have a lot of respect, but I think we have to cast light on this. I think that Speaker Rota is a victim here.
And I would like to say that according to your rules, Madam Chair, this was in fact mentioned in the witness's initial statement. So I'm on course here. So in the aftermath of this incident, Vladimir Putin sat down with Tucker Carlson, as you mentioned, in Moscow. He referenced this incident as part of his rationale for invading Ukraine. Now we, of course, are seeing the weaponization of this incident by Putin, by this coming forward of right-wing followers. And of course, we understand the dangers of this and these claims being circulated here in Canada. So what is your government, what are the steps that your government's taking to respond to bad faith actors like Tucker Carlson, like those who are truly promoting and giving that platform to that Russian propaganda?
There's no question that there exists in the West, by the West I mean broadly the Western countries, a strain of conservatism that is pro-Putin, is pro-Russia, puts support for Ukraine in question, supports and disseminates conspiracy theories about Ukraine, and repeats propaganda statements made by, among others, the president of Russia. I would submit that Mr. Carlson is certainly in that category. He's in fact expressed direct support for Russia in this conflict, which is quite incredible. And that exists in Canada. And what we have to do is stand up every day for the people of Ukraine, for our support for Ukraine, to dissipate all of these conspiracy theories and plots that are described to us sometimes on the internet, sometimes down some very dark, deep rabbit holes. We'll continue to be doing that, but one thing that will not stop is the Government of Canada's support, and I hope that of your party and that of the Bloc Québécois, uniform support, economic support, diplomatic support, military support for the people and the armed forces of Ukraine.
That sadly brings our time to an end, and it has been most invigorating as always. Minister, we thank you for your time and attention, for being here with us today. Colleagues, thank you for your fruitful conversation and discourse. Meeting is adjourned. We'll see you Thursday.